Hello, good morning. It's Tuesday, and here we are again for another reading from Slaves for the Isabella. We're on to chapter 4 now, which, as you know, I'm doing because it's Black History Month, and so this is a really big part of Black British history. Chapter 3, you might be wondering where the black element comes in. Did you spot it in the last chapter? Joe has been shown in to Lucy's house. He's had this rather elaborate tea with her mother, Lucy's mother, and Lucy herself, neither of whom are pleased to see him. They take him for Josiah de Courson, who's Lucy's cousin, come over from France. But they're not happy about it all the same, even though they're expecting Josiah de Courson. And they don't realise Joe isn't him. But did you spot the connection yet? I wonder. Okay, it will become clear really quite soon what the connection to Black history is here. Yes, so Joe's just been having some lessons with Lucy, who is not happy to have him there, and he's better at her than reading aloud, even though she thinks he's French. And the governess, Miss Waters, now says, why don't we change our routine and do French next. Chapter 4. Joe's heart stopped for a second, then beat twice as fast. That wouldn't be fair on Lucy, he said quickly. His mouth was dry. Speaking a language as your mother tongue is quite different from having to learn it. He realised as he said this that French wasn't actually Josiah's mother tongue. He pressed on, I don't know that I'd be able to help her, and I'm not sure she'd want me to. He didn't look at Lucy, but he was sure she wouldn't contradict him. I think we should carry on with the writing lesson as you normally would. Are you quite sure? Miss Waters sounded disappointed. Joe nodded vigorously. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Lucy staring at him in disbelief. Very well, as you wish. The governess pulled a wooden tray across the desk towards her, on which were 3 small glass pots. One was filled with something white and had lots of holes in the lid, like a pepper shaker. Another had 4 larger holes in the lid, 2 of them with broken feathers sticking out of them. And the third had a lid with no holes and something black inside. Miss Waters opened this last pot. Have you another quill for Master Josiah? She asked Lucy. Lucy opened a drawer in the desk and brought out a feather. She handed it to Joe with a knife and a wooden board. They seemed to be expecting him to cut his own pen. Joe placed the feather across the board and sliced the blunt end off it. Then he cut a bit more off one side. He inspected it. If this were a fountain pen, it would have a short slit down to the tip. He cut one in the longer side, then took the quill in his hand and looked up, hoping very much that he'd got it roughly right. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then Miss Waters said, Perhaps Miss Lucy could show you how it's done. Without speaking, Lucy took the feather from Joe. In a series of deft moves she cut a large section from the back of the shaft, hooked something out from the inside, cut curves either side of the nid, slit it, scraped it, and trimmed it to length, then broke off the upper part of the feather. I suppose you have someone to do this for you at home, she said scornfully, handing him the finished quill. Joe looked at it. Whichever way he answered would be wrong. Thank you, Lucy, he said quietly. A flicker of confusion passed across her face, but she didn't reply. Miss Waters pushed a sheet of paper towards each of them. Joe imitated Lucy, shaking white powder from the first pot onto the paper. He'd always thought this was done afterwards to dry the ink, but it seemed not. They brushed the powder into the surface of the paper, then tipped what was left back into a dish. Miss Waters took up the Bible once more and began to read slowly aloud. Writing must mean dictation, Joe guessed. He followed Lucy's example, dipping his quill in the ink pot. Before the tip touched the paper, however, a large black drop splashed right across the middle. Lucy's head was down, but Jo could feel her disdain radiating across the desk. As he began to scratch out the first few letters, a cloud of fine drops sprayed out. Pointedly, Lucy moved her paper away from him. When it happened a second time, she hissed, "Ruin your own work by all means, but don't ruin mine." "I'm sorry," Jo mumbled. "I'm no good at this." "You've noticed," she retorted, but her voice was less sharp than before. The next hour felt like an eternity. It wasn't difficult to make marks on the paper with the quill, not like it had been scraping letters into wax in Roman times. But Jo's pen left a trail of black spots every time he dipped it in the inkwell, and he only seemed to manage 1 or 2 awkward letters before he needed to dip it again. Miss Waters had to read every sentence twice or 3 times before Jo had got it down. Lucy, on the other hand, wrote each line smoothly and then sighed loudly while she waited for Jo to catch up. By the end of the lesson, the page in front of Jo looked as though a dozen spiders had swum in the ink and then danced themselves to death across the paper. He could hardly bear to look at Miss Waters as he handed it over. She pinched her lips together. "I see there is work to be done, Master Josiah," she said dryly. "The master at the grammar school will not be impressed by this." Jo hung his head. "I shall give you the benefit of the doubt and say that the pen Miss Lucy cut for you didn't suit your hand." She held up a finger to silence Lucy's immediate protest. "Of course, that is all the more reason to learn to cut your own quills." Jo nodded mutely. Miss Waters looked at Lucy's work. "I can see 6 errors right away, Miss Lucy, and you've entirely missed the sense of this part here." "But it's much better than Cousin Josiah's," Lucy cried. "Clearly, but Master Josiah read much better than you. Now," Miss Waters went on, "we would usually do painting next, but after this last disastrous hour, I hesitate to embark on something Master Josiah won't have learned." She turned to Jo. "Are you quite sure you wouldn't prefer to do French instead?" "No, really, let's do painting," Jo said desperately. "I have done some. Actually, I've had more practice with a paintbrush than with a quill." The dumbfounded expressions on the others' faces told Jo he shouldn't have said this. He hurried on. "We do things differently where I come from. If you don't mind me having a go, I'm willing to try." Miss Waters shrugged. "In that case, let's go down to the library. We've been painting in there while the master's away from home." She swept them before her out of the room. Lucy was preoccupied as they went down the stairs. Jo wondered if she now guessed that he wasn't Josiah. He thought about telling her the truth. The trouble was she would find it hard to believe. She always did. On the other hand, at least she was unlikely to be angry with him this time. All the same, this wasn't an ideal moment, with Miss Waters at their heels. On the ground floor, Lucy opened the door diagonally opposite the room where they'd had tea earlier. This room was slightly larger, and like Miss Waters' room, it looked out over the garden behind the house. Jo surveyed the glass-fronted bookcase, which took up most of one wall. There had hardly been any books in Lucy's worlds before. Even last time there had only been 12 or so in the whole house. Here there must be several hundred. "My father is very proud of his library," Lucy said, following Jo's gaze. "It's impressive," Jo said. "Where I come from—" He stopped. "Where you come from, what?" There was an edge to Lucy's tone. "I was just thinking a library like this would be incredibly valuable." "I suppose it probably is," Lucy said in surprise. "But you live in a castle, don't you? I'm sure your father's library is twice the size." Jo wondered whether Josiah was in the habit of showing off to his English cousins. That must be very annoying. He looked around the rest of the room. Beneath the window stood a large leather-topped desk with a chair. This must also be William's study, as well as the library, Joe realised. At each end of the desk was a globe on a wooden stand. One seemed to show countries, but the other had strange patterns of lines and dots on it. "That's a celestial globe," Lucy said, "though I don't learn astronomy." She watched him warily, waiting for his reply. "Nor do I," Joe said with a shrug. He was pleased to see her almost smile. 2 chairs had been pushed back to the wall on either side of the fireplace, and a pair of easels stood in the middle of the room. Miss Waters went to the mantelpiece and pulled a knob beside it. A few moments later, a maid appeared. "Could you fetch Miss Anne's easel and palette for Master Josiah?" Miss Waters asked her. "If there are brushes, bring those too, and 3 pots of water." While they waited for the maid to return, Miss Waters lit a taper from the fire that burned in the grate and carried it over to the wall bracket, where she lit 4 tall candles. Their light fell on the paintings already on the easels. Both were of the same landscape, but the one on the left was a good deal better than the one on the right. Lucy's governess walked around the room, looking at the pictures on the walls. "Which shall we attempt today?" she asked Lucy. "Couldn't we do one of the portraits? I've always liked the picture of the lady in the hat outside the dining room." "That will have to wait until we progress to oils," Miss Waters answered. "How about this one?" She took a painting off the wall and propped it on a chair. How odd, Joe thought, to paint from a painting. But of course cameras wouldn't have been invented yet, so Lucy couldn't paint from a photograph. And unless they went out specially, she couldn't paint a real landscape either. As though she'd heard his thought, Lucy said, "Miss Waters and I are going out to the Avon Gorge in the summer to paint the ships coming up to Bristol." Her face was bright. Then uncertainty flickered across it. "Although ships are very fiddly, and of course they'll be moving too. I have to get better first." Joe smiled. She sounded suddenly much more like the old Lucy. The 3rd easel was set up, and Miss Waters gave Lucy and Joe paper, brushes and palettes on which to mix their paints. This was like at secondary school, Joe thought. Proper artists' materials, not kids' paints. He began putting washes across the paper, just as Miss Waters did at her own easel, then moved on to the detail. He'd learnt about watercolours last term, so he managed every bit as well as Lucy. When he eventually stood back and looked at his finished picture, he was quite proud of the result. "It's very good," Miss Waters said, failing to hide her amazement. "Do boys usually learn to paint in France?" "Not always," Joe said carefully, "but I like to draw, so my mother taught me to paint." Part of this was true, at least. He had got into drawing in the last couple of years, so it was better than an outright lie. He looked at Lucy's painting, which was just as good as his, yet Miss Waters hadn't commented on it at all. "I like the way you've done those trees," he said. "They've turned out better than mine." Lucy lowered her eyes. "Thank you," she said shyly. "Go and wash your hands ready for dinner," Miss Waters said. Once again Joe realised how hungry he was. He'd been so absorbed in painting he hadn't noticed the time. In the hall the grandfather clock showed almost 2:00. Lucy led the way into a small room beside the front door. "You're different to how you were before," she said abruptly. Joe swallowed. "How was I before?" She looked away as though she hadn't meant to start this conversation. "I don't know. More French, maybe. At least you sounded more French. But also—" She paused. "Not as nice, especially not to me. You used to make fun of me all the time. I thought you didn't like me. And you were always boasting about everything." Joe thought quickly. "Maybe I've grown up a bit," he said. "I do like you a lot. I'm really happy to see you again." At once his cheeks blazed. Why had he said that? It was true, but he needn't have told her. Lucy's cheeks turned pink too. Joe looked around for a way of changing the subject. There was another mirror in this room, a normal one this time, and a delicate table beneath it with a round pot and 2 silver containers like larger versions of the shaker on the inkstand. "What's in those?" he asked, pointing. "Powder," Lucy said. "What for?" "For my parents and their visitors to powder their wigs before they go out." She looked at him quizzically. "This is the powder room, after all." Joe looked at his feet. Presumably he should have known that. Lucy went to the corner of the room where there was a washstand. On it was a bowl, a small dish with a piece of white soap and a matching jug. She poured water into the bowl and washed her hands, then waited for Joe to do the same. Joe was glad to see that the water looked clean. In Lucy's house in London, water had come through pipes to a tap over the sink, but it had been yellow and foul. "Do you need—" She opened a door Joe hadn't noticed, because it was wallpapered to match the rest of the room. Behind it was a space that was barely more than a cupboard, with a thigh-high wooden box from which came the most revolting smell. "It's a water closet," Lucy said, thinking Joe didn't understand. "The very latest design." Joe knew from experience that he must be looking at a toilet, and of course the initials of water closet were still used in his own world to mean loo. But what did the box have to do with water? There was no sign of any plumbing. Lucy stepped forward and lifted the lid. The stench was even worse. Joe shut his mouth and tried not to breathe. A large bowl painted with flowers had been set into a wooden seat. The bowl had a big hole in the bottom and a smaller hole in the side. Mounted on the seat was a handle, and next to it, half a book, its pages torn off. "When you've finished," Lucy explained, "you pull the handle, and water pours in through that hole and washes everything out through the bottom." "Right." Joe was still mystified. The water must come from a tank inside the box. But where did the poo get flushed to? As far as he could see, it must end up in the box as well, underneath the bowl. No, so it was really just a glorified potty. No wonder it stank. "You notice the closet bowl matches the washing bowl and the jug?" Lucy continued. "The porcelain's by Mr. Wedgwood." Joe could tell from the way that she spoke that he was supposed to be impressed. He did his best. Content, Lucy led the way back upstairs again to the dining room. This room was much bigger than either the library or the parlour, with 2 windows looking out over the street. It was really light in here, Joe thought, lighter than it had ever been indoors in the past. A fire burned in this grate too. Every room would have a fire, of course. Even Miss Waters' room had had one. The dining table was laid with silver cutlery on a white cloth. At each place there was a china plate, a wine glass, and a small bowl and slightly taller pot, both made of blue glass. 5 people were expected to eat, it seemed. The servants must be eating below stairs. Ellen entered the room and sat down at the head of the table. Lucy sat down to her mother's left and motioned to Joe to take the seat beside her. "How did you get on this morning?" Ellen asked. "Quite well," Lucy said. "Cousin Josiah is very good at painting." Joe waited for her to add that he was really terrible at writing, but she didn't. "How unusual," Ellen said. "Have you been schooled in other arts as well? Do you play the pianoforte?" "No, madam. Aunt." Joe coloured. "If you'd like to learn, you could join Lucy for her lessons while you're here, but perhaps that would be odd." Ellen seemed to change her mind. After all, it would be of little use to you later. Joe didn't reply. In actual fact, he did have piano lessons at home, but he couldn't bear to be asked to play. He wondered why Ellen might consider it useful for Lucy to learn the piano, but not him. Silence fell as they waited for the other 2 chairs to be filled. Joe assumed that her brother Peter was going to sit in one. He must be on his way home from school now, but that still left an extra seat. Joe was aware of worry buzzing inside him again as he contemplated this. There had been extra chairs around the table in Lucy's last world, several of them for her dead brothers and sisters. But it couldn't be that here. Suddenly the worry knotted up into cold, hard dread. How could he have forgotten? In London, there had been another person at the table. Joe's arch-enemy, the boy who had tried several times to kill him. Nobody had mentioned him yet, but Lucy's world wouldn't be complete without him. He was bound to be here somewhere. Joe watched the doorway with mounting panic. Surely the missing person was Tobias. So if you're coming into this book without having read any of the others, Tobias is Joe's enemy. He appears in every one of Lucy's worlds, and every time towards the end of the story, he tries for one reason or another to kill Joe. Always. There's always a different reason. His connection to the family is always different, but he is Joe's enemy, and Joe is right to think he must be here somewhere. But is he right to think he's about to walk in? We don't know. So there we are. We also had the Lou in that chapter, as you may have noticed. I must be the only author I know who in every one of 7 books has written about the Lou. And I do that because if you read the others, you'll find it's changed from Roman times through Viking times, through Tudor times, the Great Fire of London, now we're here. It changes every time, it's different. So yes, that's why I do it, because it's a part of our day-to-day lives and it's not always been the same. Right, okay, so that's it for today. Tomorrow, 11:15, we'll be back for chapter 5 and we'll see whether it is Tobias that's turned up, and then we'll also find out what the connection is to Black history. Right, nice to see you. See you tomorrow.